So let's chat a little bit about wetting your plants. Actually, let's chat about watering your grow medium. As growers, I feel like we're always trying to mimic the outdoor environment as much as we can, or to the best of our ability indoors, with lights and humidity and temperature. But I feel like we kind of fall short, or we don't pay as close of attention to mimicking the rain.
The dried leaves and berries are ground up and made into cigarettes by a simple hand machine. The deadly narcotic is thus quickly and easily prepared for its market.
With autoflowers in particular, having poor watering techniques is really going to cause you some issues, especially being that once they sprout, the clock is ticking, and we don't have the benefit that photoperiod growers do of just waiting and then flipping into flower. Ours are just going to go into flower automatically if you're growing autos. So it's vitally important that you really nail in the watering techniques at the beginning as to not stunt your plant. In my opinion, overwatering is one of the most, if not the number one most common beginner grower mistakes. It was definitely mine. 5 years later, it still is one of the things that I struggle with sometimes, if I'm completely honest with you. Just nailing it just right is really difficult for me sometimes. And that's okay, but that's why we're making this video. So let's chat about overwatering, underwatering, the effects that it has on our plants, and the proper way that we should be watering. I feel that a lot of the plants that I see on social media that are stunted and really small, and they're in pretty good sized pots, 3, 5, 10 gallon pots, I feel that it's done from overwatering. That's not to bag on anyone. We all have to go through a learning curve with whatever it is, whether it's growing plants or becoming a chef or whatever it is that you do. You got to get in there and do it, and there's going to be a learning curve. This usually happens when you water too often, although it can happen when you water too much, but that's kind of tricky to talk about. But in my opinion, anyways, overwatering usually happens when people are watering too often. Their soil doesn't need to be watered yet, but they go ahead and they water anyways. It can also happen if you've got poor draining soil. So you might water, maybe you water enough, a decent amount, not too much, not too little. But if you've got poor draining soil or a grow medium that is not aerated and it's compact and it's kind of just like muddy clay, that's going to definitely cause some issues. Stuff like that, first of all, takes forever to dry out. There's no air or oxygen in there. There's no aeration from any perlite or rice holes or anything like that. And your roots are really going to have a hard time growing in that anyways. To be honest with you, I don't even think the seedling would end up surviving and getting out of the seedling stage in soil like that. It'll probably end up dampening off, which is actually another subject, a different video to make. But keep in mind that the root zone, realistically, it needs to fluctuate between being wet and being lightly moist. And I say lightly moist because we don't ever really want to let the soil completely dry out. That's not good either. And we'll talk about that in a minute when we talk about underwatering. But you also, you want to make sure that you're giving your soil a chance to receive water and then begin to kind of dry out a little bit, and then receive more water and dry out a little bit. Realistically, as far as I know, that's kind of what you want to do and what you want to mimic. What does overwatering look like? Well, a good way to tell, a telltale sign everybody knows about, is when the stem itself is still stiff, but the leaf is droopy. So let's say my arm is the stem and my hand is the leaf. It just kind of looks like this, as opposed to when you underwater, the whole entire stem, tends to kind of bow down with the leaf. It can also cause spots and deficiencies in your leaves too. I've had that before. The important thing to keep in mind is that if you continue to overwater that plant, it can actually end up causing root rot, which you don't want. It's just going to pretty much ruin your grow. The leaves start to get all twisted and weird looking, and some of the newer growth and the older leaves, they can look really necrotic and weird, and your soil can begin to smell foul, and it's just a recipe for disaster. There's all kinds of bad bacteria and stuff really that's growing in that stagnant area of water with no oxygen, and we just want to stay away from that as much as we can. So if you're in soil or a potting soil, the general rule of thumb is to water your plant and then wait until the top inch of your soil is dry, or if you were to stick your finger into the soil, if up to your first knuckle is dry. That's the general rule of thumb. Others like to use the weight method by lifting the pot and just feeling how heavy it is. That's what I personally like to do these days. That's something that you more kind of have to practice and get the hang of, and it's more of an intuition. It's more of just a knowing that it needs to be watered. So yeah, just keep an eye on it, man. Just keep an eye on that top inch layer of your potting soil, and if you're unsure, if you go and you're like, well, it's kind of damp a little bit, but I don't know, is it dry, and what's considered dry, and if you're unsure, just wait a few hours, and go check back and see if your plant still looks good, and if the leaves are looking good and they're healthy, then maybe just wait a little bit longer, and just wait until the top inch of that soil is pretty dry. And if you do end up overwatering, man, don't freak out. Just set your plant aside, allow it to dry. The plant's going to take up some of that water. Some of that water is just going to evaporate into the air, especially if you're in a fabric pot. Another thing you can do if you're in a fabric pot and your soil is totally saturated and overwatered is you can set it on top of like a folded towel and allow that towel to draw some of the moisture out of your pot. I've done that before. I've also set a fan or two up and just blew it onto the sides of a fabric pot just to create some airflow and try to dry out some of that soil a little bit. So there's a couple of things you can do if you overwater, but mostly just let it dry out, man. When you get to the top inch of that soil being dry, then just go ahead and water again. Underwatering your plants can cause issues as well. Similar to overwatering, you're going to see your leaves droop, but the stems are also going to droop with it. And obviously, if you look down, your soil is going to look bone dry, especially from the top. If your plant is so underwatered that your leaves and your stems are drooping, then that soil is going to be dry. And if it's not, then it's not underwatered. So it's actually pretty simple to tell. The leaves also feel like thin and kind of papery. Almost, they feel almost like a fake plant to me when they're underwatered. If left too long and you don't water, your leaves can actually start to yellow. The tips can start to look burnt, especially if there's any salts that are drying up in the soil. It can even show signs of deficiencies. So again, when the top inch of the soil is dry, just go ahead and water. If you stick your finger down and it's dry like all the way up into here, then it's definitely overdue. It's definitely time to water. And when you do go to water, if you're gone for a couple of days or things happen, man, and you come back and it's like they're just wilted. I had one time when I was camping and I left my plants and I thought they were going to be okay, and I came back and I thought they were dead, man. And I watered them, and within a few hours they perked back up and they lived. I mean, they were stressed, but they lived. But when you do go to water and your soil is bone dry, I personally suggest watering it slow, right? Like imagine a rain coming, right? Like when it rains, it doesn't just dump 2 gallons of water into your pot and fill up the top and just let it all gush down. Like water it a little and allow that water to kind of work its way down, and then water a little more and allow that water to kind of soak in. You want to allow all that soil to kind of soak up that water, and if you just dump water in there, what's going to happen is it's just going to end up running through channels or create channels in your soil, and you might not saturate all of your medium. So I personally suggest watering slowly. Again, just try to think of like mimicking a rainfall, where it's it waters and it just slowly kind of seeps down into the soil. Some other general tips on watering: if you're in an organic potting soil or like a super soil or a living soil, I would definitely try to water just enough to get the soil wet and saturated, but not to really have any runoff. You don't really want to flush out or run off any microbes or nutrients that are in your soil. But you want to water just enough to kind of allow that water to soak and seep down into the bottom, but not really come gushing out and have a bunch of runoff as if you were growing synthetically. Now, if you are growing synthetically and you're fertigating, which is just fertilized water, and you're watering with a salt-based nutrient, be sure to water until you do get about 10 to maybe 20% runoff. You want to be sure that you're flushing some of the salts out that are in the soil from the previous time that you watered, so that you don't have salt buildup in your soil or in your cocoa, and you can end up getting a lockout, which you don't want to deal with, because then your plant isn't going to be able to uptake nutrients. Then you're going to find yourself flushing the crap out of that soil to get all of those salts out, and then coming back and feeding again. So it's better to just try to like prevent that and bypass that, and just make sure that you're watering to runoff like anywhere between 10 to 20%. And another thing to mention is your environment, right? Like your environment might be completely different than my environment. I live in a really dry environment. I live in an environment where like the humidity gets down to like 13% outside. It's like really dry, skin gets dry, chapped lips, staticky. It kind of sucks, to be honest with you. But in my environment, like my soil and stuff will dry out really quick. Now, if you live in a humid environment, you got to keep that in mind too. You know, your soil, it might take a lot longer to dry out. So if you've got a seedling in a final pot, keep in mind that when you water that thing, it might take a lot longer for your soil to dry out than mine. And so that's why it's kind of subjective as far as like how much to water and when. Typically when your plant is full grown, I'd say the general rule of thumb is that you're watering every 2 to 3 days. If that's the case, then I'd say you're doing a good job and you've got it locked in right where it should be. Any longer than that, maybe like later in flower at the very end when your plant isn't really growing as much and taking up as much water. But in general, I find that I'm watering like every 2 to 3 days when I have a full grown plant in a container. Obviously when it's younger, that could fluctuate and change. And like I said, it also depends on your environment. All these different factors play into how fast your soil and stuff's gonna dry out. Well, I hope this video helped you out a little bit if you found it and you're having watering issues. If I missed anything or if you've got a different technique, man, I'm open ears. Please leave a comment in the comment section. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. See ya.
Nicotine, alcohol, good drugs. Coincidentally, tax drugs. Ooh, how does this fucking work?
The deadly narcotic are ground up and made into cigarettes by a simple hand machine.
Bruh.